Hello, and welcome to episode 65 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Sautra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Remco Heesen, faculty member in philosophy at the University of Western Australia. Remco's research considers what happens after scientific evidence is collected, such as the scientist's choice of when to share her findings and how peer review may affect what gets reported. So just like the question of what to believe, these decisions and their outcomes may be epistemically appraised. We would like the social organization of science to be such that properly collected evidence and well-justified hypotheses are shared widely and their opposites are not. The claim here is that in order to understand the rationality of science, it is at least as important to understand the rationality of science as a social system as it is to understand the rationality of individual scientists. Given its complexities, the system of science must be studied piecemeal. And now, for more on this, without further ado, let's bring in Remco. Dr. Remco Heesen, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this morning? Afternoon, I should say.
Yeah, I'm doing very well. It's nice to be on the show. As you say, it's a lovely afternoon here. Looks like spring is coming on.
How are things? Is it in Amsterdam where you're calling us from?
I'm in Groningen at the moment.
Oh, okay. How are things over there?
Yeah, it's really nice. I'm doing a part-time postdoc here, so I'm spending some time here since December, and it's really lovely.
Great. What is in terms of the postdoc? Is it a directed project or something along the lines of your own work? What are you up to over there?
Yes, I'm on an independent grant that I got from the Dutch Organization for Scientific Research.
Mm-hmm.
So I get to do my own thing, and I'm sure we'll get into the details more. But the basic project is on biases in peer review.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Very good. And I'm glad to hear about it. And once again, thanks again for coming on and taking the time. All right, well let's get started and jump right into learning about how you got into your current role and ultimately we'll talk about your new position with which you've just accepted recently, correct? Just 3 days ago, is that what you just mentioned?
Well, I'm moving in a couple of days.
Oh, you're moving in a couple of days. It's been accepted for a while. Yeah. So we get to hear about what as an early career scholar, what it takes to get a job in Australia. But anyway, let's start back at the beginning. So Remco, where did you grow up?
So I'm originally Dutch. And basically, my childhood was sort of split between two towns in the Netherlands. One is called Papendrecht, and the other is called Arnhem. So Papendrecht is sort of on the west of the Netherlands. It's actually in the Dutch Bible Belt, although that's not a concept I was really aware of when I was a child. Mm-hmm. Other than that, people on Sunday would wear hats, was kind of the way I would notice this. And then Arnhem is more on the east of the country. That's where my parents are both from originally, from that area. So we moved in that direction when I was 11 or 12 to be a bit closer to my grandparents as well. And my parents still lived in that area.
Wow. What were things like in Amsterdam for you? What was life like growing up as a kid? As a young adolescent in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, in these two spaces?
It's hard to compare, right? Because I've never grown up anywhere else.
Sure.
It was nice. The Netherlands seems to have most of the basics sorted out pretty well. We had our food, we had our schools, we had our clothes, we had our toys. All the basics were well provided for. Mm-hmm. And of course, me being as many of the listeners as well, I imagine a nerdy little kid. I was reading a lot of books and getting into games that were mostly inside rather than playing sports and going outside.
Sure.
But yeah.
Okay. Well, like many of us, we were quite the nerdy kids in growing up. What were you interested in?
So I was definitely into reading books, fiction, like read a lot of science fiction, a lot of fantasy, a lot of like horror stories and that kind of thing. I really loved the library where you could check out, I think, 10 books at a time, and I would finish them in less than a week sometimes and go back to get more. In that library in Papendrecht, I must have read like most of the children's books in there.
And you said horror stories. Do you what kinds of horror?
Yeah, maybe that's not a good translation, but there's this genre of like books aimed at children that are sort of meant to scare you a bit, like, scary stories.
Okay, no, I recall. I remember those.
Having like vampires or werewolves or those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. So, in terms of philosophy, was philosophy in when was this introduced to you?
So I guess there was a short bit of philosophy at the end of primary school. So I would have been about 11 when I was first introduced to sort of the word philosophy as its own thing. But that was very short and not like, I was like, oh, this is interesting. And then just, I didn't hear about it or didn't learn more about it for many years. But towards the end of secondary school, we could take a proper course in it. And so that's when I guess I was interested in that course. And after I started taking it, it was something I knew I was definitely very interested in. So this would have been around the age of 15, 16, something like that.
Okay. And what was it that was so interesting?
So I guess at this point, I'd become more interested in like the social sciences and the humanities than the natural sciences, I guess, in terms of my general secondary school curriculum. And philosophy in particular was interesting to me because we would just have these very wide-ranging discussions, and this was encouraged by the teacher as well. So there was a lot of opportunity to talk about different things. And it was funny because while in some ways it could sometimes be very abstract, at the same time it felt like it was much more immediately relevant to life than most of the other courses we were taking. So that's something that really appealed to me. Like on the one hand, sort of having this opportunity to think abstractly, but on the other hand, feeling like you were actually talking about something real. Yeah.
So what, in terms of talking about something real and somewhat abstract, do you recall some of the questions and or issues that you were dealing with at the time?
It's been a while, yeah. I know. Yeah, so I guess I think it was at that time was mainly like ethics related questions that would have been of particular interest to me. Like I was just, being an adolescent, I was trying to think about what it meant to be a good person. And then I think also already at that time I had interest in like what is science and how can we understand science. So epistemological and philosophy of sciencey questions were also, I think, already of interest to me. But I think it was the ethics questions that really felt like they were sort of immediately applicable to things in my life going on at the time.
Fantastic. And actually, just before we go on, Remco, I'm going to have us cut out the video just to improve the audio. I've been hearing a little bit of clicking. So
yeah, I'll do the same.
Yeah, and just like that just tends to be better. But I've really liked where this is going so far. But that should hopefully help with the audio a bit. Okay, so we were discussing just some general early interests in philosophy and in the sciences. What did you want to be when you grew up? What were some of your I don't know, in considering what kind of person did you want to be? What were you thinking in terms of either career or kind of path in life?
I don't think I was ever really a person to be like, oh, I want to be this or that when I grow up.
Right.
I was more of I was more always kind of focused on like making sure that whatever thing I had to decide at that time was something that made sense for me then, you know. So picking a secondary school or a university degree or whatever, not so much based on what I wanted to do with it later, but what I was interested in right then. So you know, at the time starting undergrad, I was interested, in addition to philosophy, I was interested in mathematics and economics. And that was something that I thought I would really enjoy learning more about. So that's what I initially picked to study as my major was econometrics, where I could sort of combine these interests in maths and statistics on the one hand, and economics as an area to apply it to as well.
Okay. And so how did you go about, I don't know, and is studying and or looking after this?
So I guess one of the things I realized when I was starting at Tilburg, the University of Tilburg, to do my undergrad, was that I ended up having quite a bit of free time. So something that was true then, and I think that's changing now, and I think that's perhaps not such a great thing, is that if you were good at self-studying and relatively efficient about this, you wouldn't necessarily have to spend all that much time on the particular courses. And so there was room to develop other interests and pursue other things. And so this led me to think, I really like philosophy in secondary school. I should take some courses on the side.
Sure.
Because I had time to do that. And this ended up developing into I ended up doing both next to each other, econometrics and philosophy. I ended up doing the full philosophy degree because, this was possible in a way that if you were getting a lot of busy work, wouldn't have been possible.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. So what were things like at Tilburg?
Yeah, Tilburg's quite nice. It's a small town. It's an old industry town. It's not necessarily particularly pretty looking, but it's got a lot of students, and there's a lot of social science students and economics students in particular. That's kind of what it's known for. It's got a profile in terms of areas of specialization, kind of similar to the London School of Economics, where I did my master's a little bit later. And it was really nice. You could learn about these things, as I was just saying, and at the same time there was an active student life where I was involved both with student associations related with the different degrees, as well as I was playing a lot of table tennis at the time. I could do that as well.
Oh, really?
So there was lots to do there.
Yeah. So I see on the page you were awarded the best master's thesis prize. How did this come about, and what was your work on?
Yeah, so I was doing masters to sort of in the Netherlands they have these 1-year master's degrees that are kind of closely integrated with the 3-year bachelor's degrees. So it was kind of expected that you would do a 3-year bachelor's and then immediately continue into a 1-year master's. And so I was doing a master's thesis where I was developing this management game for transportation planning, and then studying it using game theory, and in particular trying to show that cooperation would be beneficial to the competing transportation companies, right? So they could basically share trucks, and then basically by doing that save on the number of total trucks that they needed to use, and then share the profits, and everyone would be better off. Excuse me. So I developed this management game, and it went really well. We played it with some clients of the company that was cooperating for this, and that went really well. And then after I graduated, I immediately went to the LSE to do my master's in philosophy of science.
Yeah,
and the London School of Economics, that is. And then it was sort of a few months into being in London when I heard that I was nominated for this thesis prize. So apparently, I don't know exactly how it works. If the advisor was sort of nominating people based on the master's thesis they had seen, or if maybe there was a grade cutoff where they looked at all the theses that were above a certain grade or something. I don't know. But somehow they'd come up with me being a finalist for this.
Yeah.
And so on relatively short notice, I just went back to Tilburg to go to this. There was this, they called it Dies Natalis, so the birthday celebration of the university where they awarded these things. And so here I was sitting among all these professors in their togas, and I received this prize, which was pretty cool and a big surprise for me.
Yeah, I bet. So was it at this time, I mean, were you pretty, the idea of continuing to study and to do work in philosophy and in science, was this a kind of an event that led you or further kind of encouraged you to go forward? Or, how did these kinds of successes influence your decisions to continue to study and move on?
Yeah, I guess at the time I wasn't really all that set yet on being an academic.
Yeah.
So I decided to do this 1-year master's at the LSE in philosophy of science because I figured, well, I did the bachelor's and master's in econometrics, might as well sort of get the full set in philosophy as well, and then kind of figure out where I stand. And I was still thinking, econometrics was certainly at the time probably still a fairly marketable degree. So I thought, probably just get a job with that and maybe work for the company that I did my master's thesis with or something like that.
Sure.
And that seemed like a very plausible path to me. And it wasn't until about 6 months in or so at the LSE when I was like, well, I'm enjoying this so much that I could see myself at least doing this for another 4 years or so and get a PhD and then reevaluate if I want to be an academic or if I want to, after all, go into the private sector or something.
Yeah.
So it was in a sense. So I guess things like this prize were encouraging that I could continue on this path into academia. But at the time I received it, I wasn't necessarily set on that yet.
And yeah, so in terms of this potential alternate path of industry, and having studied econometrics, like what exactly would you have done? What kinds of positions or kinds of work could you have found yourself going into?
So at least in the Netherlands, I think this is fairly unique to the Netherlands that econometrics is kind of its own degree, separate both from statistics and economics. And there's kind of this small group of consultancy firms that cater specifically to people getting that degree. So it seemed like, at least to me, having never really pursued that path, it seemed to me like there was a sort of relatively ready-made path being laid out for people like me. Yeah. So I imagined if I were to join one of these consultancy firms, I would have a job where like part of it would be to like do a lot of modeling, probably like transportation modeling, like the kind of thing I'd been doing in my master's thesis, and then sort of selling that to clients in various ways as a way for them to make more money. I guess that would be the content of a job like that.
Yeah, I was curious about the modeling of the transportation. Was this something that, how did you come up with this particular problem? I mean, and was this particular problem just of general interest regarding the model itself, or was there some general, epistemic interest beyond this that was drawing you toward this kind of problem?
Yeah, so I guess at this time I wasn't really yet capable of coming up with my own projects.
Fair enough.
So this was something that was more or less handed to me. I was the thing that I did, the thing that was my own initiative, was to go to this company and say, "Hey, can I do a master's project with you?" And then this company was like, "Yeah, okay, we have space for someone, and you look like an interesting person to work with. So, like, here are 2 or 3 ideas we have for projects that someone could do." And that's kind of how that came about. And I think it's a bit of a coincidence that it involved game theory, which is, of course, something that I've continued to use in my work.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, in your decision to carry on and not kind of go on this kind of well-made path in the Netherlands, I should actually say, I don't get to talk to a lot of folks from the Netherlands. So I guess what is like the academic climate like in the Netherlands? Is there a particular kind of, are there particular programs, like, for example, economics, that are like much more championed or encouraged? In terms of universities, obviously there's a number of universities, but you've had we'll get to it. You've had a time to be in the States as well as study there, and study in London. But what are things like in the Netherlands?
Yeah, so there are something like 14 or 15 universities in the Netherlands, and the thing that's kind of unique about them is that I think they're all kind of in the top 200 or so in the world, but none of them are in the top 50, something like that.
Okay.
So there's a relatively, you might say they're kind of relatively egalitarian in a way. They're all pretty good, but there's not one or two of them there's no Harvard of the Netherlands, so to speak.
Right.
And I mean, that's in some ways that's reflective of Dutch culture more generally, which is quite egalitarian in many ways. And perhaps this relates in some ways to this interesting phenomena that's also, I think, quite unique to the Netherlands, which is this culture among students. There's this, at least the reputation of Dutch students is that they do just enough to get a pass and nothing more.
Oh, really?
And at least I've found this to be true, having now been at a number of different universities. If I compare my fellow students when I was at Tilburg to my fellow students at the LSE or CMU later on, as well as the students that I've taught in other countries than the Netherlands, it seemed to me that the Dutch students were, there was at least a large proportion of them that were not that intrinsically motivated and tended to be satisfied with just doing the minimal work that was required. Sure. Which, depending on how you look at it, that's either like very rational, or very, or very unmotivated.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, this is the common feature of a lot of public institutions in the United States as well. And I would say, the ones you particularly picked, Carnegie Mellon is an example of like a very of an institution from my experience or from what I've known and spoken with of a very highly motivated students. Not a place to get your degree and then move on kind of a place or a bare minimum kind of thing. It attracts and accepts some of the best and brightest in terms of the most highly intrinsically motivated.
So I guess what doesn't really exist in the Netherlands is those one or two places where all the really highly motivated people go, or at least I think 10, 15 years ago that didn't exist.
Sure. Is there, instead of academia, is there another, I imagine, motivation exists in the Netherlands, but is it maybe geared directed in other facets of life?
Well, I think it's just more that the culture is that you don't show this motivation, right? So it's like someone who is highly motivated, obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious, but I think given where I've gone later, it's not surprising to hear. I was very interested in my university studies and I was very motivated, but it was just not something that you really would show to other people as well.
Right.
It wasn't really, it was sort of socially more acceptable to be sort of very casual about your studies than to be like, oh, this is so interesting, I want to learn so much more about this or whatever.
Gotcha. I can understand that, and I believe some of that can exist in I'm sure other places as well. Right. Okay. Well, we go where for those of us who are highly motivated or find ways, especially in higher education, we find places of institutions where to go. So I imagine the LSE was particularly motivating. What drew you to Carnegie Mellon though after completing the master's at the LSE?
Yeah, so I was I was still at a stage where my own sense for interesting questions and who to work with and so on was not super well developed yet. So I just went to my advisors at the LSE and I was like, look, I'm really interested in what I'm doing here. I'd like to do a PhD. Can you help me out? And they basically said two things. Like, first of all, it'd be great to have you here to work on a PhD, but also, second of all, it's very competitive, so you'd be smart to apply to other places as well to improve your chances of getting in somewhere and getting funding somewhere in particular. And so they recommended a couple of places where I could apply, many of which were in the US, and so I did. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky enough to be accepted in a number of places, including CMU. And then I went to go visit, and I got really excited. So it wasn't until quite a while after I applied, when I'd already been accepted, when I really decided, like, this is a place that I really want to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I've recently had an opportunity to speak with a number of folks, either professors at CMU or those who have studied at CMU. What was your experience like at Carnegie Mellon, which is the university in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, known for its sort of a lot of technologically advanced focused programs, computer science, engineering, but also a pretty unique philosophy department. So, yeah, what was your experience like there?
Yeah, I mean, I always joked that computer science was so dominant at CMU that any degree you were taking that was not computer science was the computer science of whatever field it was you were studying. So in our case, that meant we were studying the computer science of philosophy, which is not perhaps literally true, but it's also not entirely false either. So there was a lot of people interested in statistics and machine learning and computer science that were also present in the philosophy department. And I think that does typify. Sorry?
Well, I hadn't really thought until this moment about the potential influence of just being in this community where computer science is so dominant, and how I'm wondering if that influence, like you have folks who are attracted to that, but then by being there, is that just sort of, are you then drawn to questions related to computer science or things like programming or statistics? Just part of being
I'm not quite sure what the direction of causality is here, but I think so. Dana Scott was an emeritus of CMU, and I think he had a dual appointment in philosophy and computer science. Mm-hmm. Teddy Seidenfeld has a dual appointment in philosophy and statistics. David Danks has a dual appointment in philosophy and psychology. Right. So this is a department that really takes interdisciplinarity very seriously, and that means that there's, from the faculty just within the department, there's a lot you can learn about other disciplines than philosophy. But also, because they're also interdisciplinarily focused, they're also very encouraging to just go into these other departments, like machine learning, like statistics, to learn from the faculty in those other departments about things that could be relevant to your own studies. So there was really this interdisciplinary atmosphere that was really stimulating.
Yeah. So, so maybe tell us a little bit about how you came to approach doing philosophy of science. Like, how did you, I'm sure you actually probably learned a lot at Tilburg, at LSE. We didn't get to chat much about that, but how did you develop your overall approach into doing philosophy of science? And why do you think that approach works for you?
Yeah, so I was, when I was at Tilburg and at the LSE, what I was doing was mainly decision theory. Okay. Questions about the foundation of decision theory, the St. Petersburg paradox, the basics of, Bayesian decision theory, that kind of thing. And this was something that I think, it kind of made sense for me to study those things because I had this combination of backgrounds from econometrics and philosophy. And it was something that, and game theory as well, were things that I was already familiar with from econometrics. And I could bring some of the formal skills that I'd learned there into some of the philosophical questions. And this was something that was encouraged by my early mentors. And it wasn't until, even though I did the master's in philosophy of science at the LSE, it wasn't really until I came to CMU that I really began to identify as a philosopher of science, as distinct from a decision theorist. So it was actually when I came to visit CMU for the first time that I saw Kevin Zollman give a talk, who would turn out to be my advisor, where he was using simulations to answer questions about the epistemology of testimony. And I saw him give that talk, and I was like, oh, that's the kind of thing I want to do. I was at first, when I was doing decision theory, I was maybe a little bit like, oh, I have a hammer, I know things about formal methods and about decision theory and so on, and so I'm just gonna use this hammer. But it was when I learned about social epistemology and philosophy of science that I really started to feel like, I'm actually really motivated and interested in these questions. And it just so happens that using formal methods and the skills that I already have, I think I'll be able to say some interesting things about them. So that was, I think, when I sort of became even more intrinsically motivated to study the questions that I ended up studying.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about those questions, maybe one or two, and how you came to, using formal methods, go about addressing them, and your own assessment of your success in doing so.
Well, I don't know about that last question.
Yeah. But, maybe save that for another time.
So my general area of research is what's called the social structure or the social dimensions of science.
Yeah.
That's something that I find really fascinating. Right, scientists do all these things that they do a lot of different things, but some of the things they do are these explicitly social interactions where they exchange information, they peer review things, they publish things, they cite things, they give each other jobs. They do all these things that are not explicitly sort of about the scientific contents, but that do have important influence on what kind of scientific content gets created and what kind of scientific content gets certified and taken seriously.
Absolutely.
So a lot of my basically all of my research is about trying to understand these aspects of science and how they can, insofar as science has been successful, these things have apparently also worked well to a certain degree. And so trying to understand what works well about the social dimensions of science, but then also how they might potentially be improved to make science work even better.
Right. So, I mean, we understand, someone who might not be a philosopher of science or a social scientist of science, or understands that science is social in some ways. But what do you really mean by social dimension? And what do you mean by social dimension? And why is studying these things important?
So, So I think what I was just saying was trying to give a bit of an indication of why it's important, right? We want to try to understand why, how these aspects of science help science work well and how they can potentially be improved. Right. And what exactly do I mean by social dimensions? Well, so one thing that I've studied quite a bit is this is the role of credit in science. Mm-hmm. So there's this idea that scientists give each other credit, so recognition or prestige or whatever you want to call it, and they kind of give this to each other by citing each other, by putting things in prestigious journals, by giving each other jobs, and so on. And they tend to do this, or at least it seems that they roughly try to aim to do this in proportion to the importance of someone's scientific discoveries, scientific contributions. Mm-hmm. And so, because scientists get credit for their discoveries, and because they know that this credit is important because it's going to influence their job opportunities, their funding opportunities, their number of graduate students they can have, and so on.
Yeah,
it's going to be something that is going to perhaps become, it's in some way it's going to motivate them, right? It's going to depend on the individual scientist whether they care about credit just for the sake of science, or whether to some degree becomes a motivation in its own right. Whether the scientist explicitly wants to become famous or not, or whether they're just someone who wants to get credit because it allows them to do better science. That's not any of those situations could arise. But it does mean that we have a bit of an understanding of the kinds of things that scientists are going to go after, right? They're going to go after these kinds of results that are going to get them credit. And so we can study their motivations in light of this and get a sense for what they're likely to do.
Yeah.
So the thing I did in my dissertation was I looked at these decision theoretic models, or these or sometimes game theoretic models, and I sort of just plugged in credit as a kind of utility function, and I was able to show that scientists are going to often have an interest in sharing their results early and often. Right? Because if you share your results, you're putting yourself in a position where you can get credit for them. This is explicitly, right, the social dimension of science, right?
Right.
There's I think a strong argument to be made that a scientific result that's not shared isn't really a scientific result.
Sure.
But so scientists have a motivation to share their results early and often, and then this is going to have positive and negative side effects, if you will, because on the one hand, sharing early is good when you have this important scientific breakthrough or even just a small improvement on something, right? If you do something well, then it's good if you share it, because then other people can sort of build on that and progress science even further. But also, if errors or half-baked ideas are being shared early, then that might actually cause problems, right?
Sure.
So I actually think this is one way in which this incentive structure, this credit structure, has actually contributed to the replicability crisis that we're currently seeing, and that's being talked about quite a bit.
Yeah, I see this paper coming out in the Journal of Philosophy, or I guess it came out last year, of why the reward structure of science makes reproducibility problems inevitable. Can you maybe kind of unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, so the idea is that in short, it's just what I just said, right? So if scientists are motivated to get credit for their results, they're going to want to share them.
Right.
And in particular for an individual scientist, it's going to be rational to sort of err more on the side of putting out a lot of different ideas rather than trying to think too hard about any particular one of them. If you put too much effort into each idea, then like if there's sort of a false negative in the peer review system, right? You get this really well thought out good idea, but then it doesn't get published in a good journal, then that's going to hurt you really bad. But if you just put out a lot of relatively poorly thought out ideas, then you can rely on the inevitable false positives in the peer review system to get you a lot of credit potentially. So that's what I basically argue in this paper, is that largely independent of the particular statistical methods that people are using and even the particular way that people are doing peer review, it's likely that just in virtue of the fact that people want credit, there's going to be more problems with reproducibility than you might like.
Right.
And so at least part of the replicability crisis might be able to be explained in this way, just through the incentives that scientists have.
That's a very interesting point. So from what I hear is certainly that not only can we understanding kind of this goes back to the why question of why I was interested in these social dimension, is that it really helps us to better understand some of our pressing problems, actual problems that are happening in the science, such as reproducibility, things that are we would consider like epistemic problems. Like by looking at the social dimensions, we kind of almost jump into these we might be able to better explain and understand other kinds of problems. In other words, social issues don't just understand social problems. They are social. They might be social problems, but they connect in other ways.
No, that's totally right. I think that one of the other really interesting problems that that some of my research and some of the people who are working in this area as well really bears on is some of the questions about trust in science and trust in science policy, right? So we have all these debates about science currently going on. There's this debate about climate science. There's debates about the safety of vaccinations, those kinds of things, where I think the social dimensions of science really show up, and we can really shed light on at least parts of those issues of why it is or isn't the case that scientists are able to sort of bring their results to a broader public in an efficient way.
Right. Yeah. So I guess very interested in these particular results and these particular descriptions of kind of what's going on. And for those of us, who might be interested in investigating the social dimensions, what kind of methods did you use in order to make these to make your arguments and to ultimately to come to these conclusions?
Yeah. So for me, they're largely formal methods having to do with decision theory, game theory, or probability theory or statistics that are being brought in to make these models that I study as a way to get a sense for what scientists' motivations might be or what patterns you might see in a particular situation. So that's something you can bring in here. Something else that you can bring in is some of the sociological research that's been done.
Sure.
On these topics, right? So there's a lot of both qualitative and quantitative sociological research on how scientists do peer review, for example, or how they reward each other, and that can be used as data, or can be brought in conversation with some of these topics and these questions that I've been talking about.
Yeah, I have my own personal interest. In my own particular work related to this integration research agenda of trying to combine perspectives. That seems more of like an ideal. There have been folks who are studying science. In some ways, it is a social dimension, this interdisciplinarity work. But they've used things like cognitive ethnographies. Basically, you're right. More sociologically known methods. How does someone like yourself, using these formal methods and studying these models, might think about or be informed by the sociological kind of stuff that you might see out there?
Yeah, it can be in different ways. So sometimes sociological work can be used to motivate particular assumptions in a model, right? Mm-hmm. So you might see that. So one thing I've done before is I've looked at existing quantitative sociological work on how often and when in their career scientists publish, and use that to model sort of the random process in my model that's generating the publications within the model. So you can sort of motivate an assumption using existing empirical research. But also more often than not, sociological work can be a way also to challenge your assumptions, right? Especially the more qualitative sociological research might show you the exceptions to the patterns or the assumptions that you're building into your model.
Right.
So famously, Robert Merton has these different norms that the norms that he applies to science, communism and disinterestedness and organized skepticism and so on. And universalism is the fourth one. And but then when they did these ethnographic studies on scientists, asking them how do you treat these norms and what do you do, then they found a certain amount of support as well for sort of the norms that were exactly the opposite of what Merton had said they were. So it's can also be a check on overgeneralizing and showing you that actually, even when you think that there are these patterns, there are always exceptions to those. Okay.
Very good. That's great to hear that there is somewhat of a connection, and these things can be either informed or helpful conversation can come. So in this work, my next question is: have you come to any normative conclusions? Do you offer any normative or recommendations in terms of your findings, and or is your work mainly descriptive?
Yeah, so there's definitely a normative component, or at least a normative ambition there. So I think most explicitly in my more recent work on peer review, I've been thinking about what the best way forward might be.
Yeah.
So this connects to this question that I was raising a little bit earlier about, like, well, if you're if you're a citizen or even a scientist with a slightly different specialization, how do you know which experts to trust, right?
Right.
And peer review plays an important role in that, or at least I think it's usually perceived to play an important role in that, because peer review plays this role of putting sort of ideally the best papers in the best journals, and so people who are not experts themselves can just look at what's published in the best journals and get access to the best work, and so they don't have to figure out for themselves who the real experts are, because the journals can tell them that.
Right.
And then the problem with that is that actually peer review and this whole journal system are actually really poor at doing this, because there's this huge degree of randomness in peer review, right? So you have 1 to 3 people usually reviewing any particular paper for any particular journal, and even between those 1 to 3, if there's 2 or 3 of them, they often tend to disagree among themselves even. Let alone what like a larger subset of the community might have thought of that particular paper. So what you end up finding is that there's a huge amount of false positives and false negatives, you might say, in peer review. And so what that means is not only does it mean that for someone who's just not an expert, who's just looking at the literature, journal quality is just not that good of an indication of the quality of any particular paper.
Right.
But it also means for someone who is sort of explicitly out to manipulate or, wants to mislead people, they can actually cherry pick from the results that are published in the literature. And for any controversial issue, they can actually go in and just find a paper that doesn't necessarily have very good quality, but it did happen to get published in a good journal, and they can sort of tout that as supporting their position and confuse people even further.
Yeah. And this is an unfortunate, you're right, fact of the way things can work in the sciences. And I imagine there's, the ways of which you describe, I think these are not, I imagine scientists, if you speak with them, a lot of them are kind of aware of these kind of practices, yet a lot of these are seen as, kind of not either unethical or they're seen as gaming the system. But I guess, how much then are, I guess, suppose your normative, kind of conclusions about how to deal with peer review in conversation with like research ethics, or I should say almost like the ethics of peer review or the ethics of publishing, and how scientists just sort of, they might not be engaged in this kind of more rigorous philosophical understanding, but they're generally, they generally want to do well, and they generally can kind of sense have some sense of when, this doesn't feel quite right, or oh, this feels, like a bad practice. How might you are now, or maybe in the future, go about having those conversations?
Yeah, I think many scientists take the same view on peer review that Churchill supposedly took on democracy. Right, mm-hmm. It's the worst of all systems, except for all the other ones that have been tried.
Yeah.
I think people are generally aware that peer review is far from perfect, but it depends a lot on who you talk to, how excited or hesitant they are about experimenting with alternatives.
Gotcha.
And you're right. So my research is mainly on the epistemic aspects here, right? So how can we make peer review better such that science works better epistemologically?
Yep.
But you're absolutely right that there's ethical questions here as well, and these do come up in my research. So I've published on triple anonymous versus double anonymous peer review, for example, and it's clear that there's not just epistemic questions there, but also questions about how biases can affect peer review and how that it affects the individual people from an ethical perspective.
Sure.
So that's definitely something to be aware of when you're thinking about potential changes.
Have you heard of any pretty very distinct alternatives that have been suggested or proposed?
Yeah, so that's where I was going with this.
Yeah.
It's taking me a while to get to my actual normative claim
great.
here.
Fantastic! I'm excited.
But my suggestion is that, we should at least experiment with, if not completely overhaul, the peer review system. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is to experiment more with post-publication peer review, right? So the idea here would be that we essentially publish everything, and then we worry about sort of sorting it in terms of what's really a good contribution and what turns out to be a half-baked idea or an error after we've published it. And so people can write peer review reports, but sort of anyone who's interested can do that, and we can keep track of things like average scores that things accumulate as they get more and more reviews. And I think if you, in this way, get more of a community involved in the judgment of what counts as good work, and also you allow a bit more time for this, you allow this to develop a little bit, you're going to get much more accurate sense of what's actually good and important and what's not.
Yeah. How would this, I'm trying to think, how would this impact the sharing, like if you were to develop this kind of post-publication review system, how might you see it impact the current social dimensions, such as eagerness to early share, to take less time on things, to cite, each other's work in sort of a pool, kind of like a you cite, I'll cite, I cite you, you cite me. How might it impact these other social dimensions?
I'm inclined to think largely these two questions are independent of each other.
Okay.
So there's a sense in which parts of mathematics and physics already kind of work the way I described, because they have archive.org, and they kind of put everything on there. And then publishing it in a journal is kind of an afterthought. So that's somewhat similar to publishing everything and then having kind of post-publication peer review.
I've heard of this.
What's interesting about... Sorry?
Well, I remember, and I've just spoken with a mathematician that where there's the mathematicians folks, there's a sense of publishing on this archive, but there's like a timing where you publish it literally at like a certain time, so it gets to the top of the list. Like literally, like let's say if it closes at 5, you publish at 4:59:59. And so if you submit,
I've heard this as well. There's a certain timing to get into people's inboxes on Monday morning or something like that.
Exactly, which is just, I mean, I guess, we all have to get, trying to get concert tickets. That's what we would do or something. But it's just really fascinating that, this guy,
totally. Yeah. So what's really interesting now is that in these fields, people have less and less compunction about just citing papers by their archive, title or their archive number or whatever. And so, citation is something that can still happen. Early sharing is something that not only can happen with the system, but it's actually encouraged more than it is now, right? So when you have something that's in good shape, you just publish it, and then you worry about potentially improving it in response to post-publication peer review. But it's already out there and people can use it. So if it is a good idea, people can get the benefit from it. And if it's not such a good idea, then people can point that out.
Right.
So there is a sense in which I think it can improve on the current system, even also with respect to those issues. Yeah,
it's it would also, I mean, people understand now that a paper gets published and then publication isn't perfect, but there does seem still to be like a large reaction to if a paper is published and then it turns out to not be so good. People are really, it's like they know it's bad, but then they still get angry about the fact that it's bad. Like, you knew before that this isn't a perfect system, yet they're like, oh my gosh, how could this journal do this? They're like, well, this is how it's like there's an awareness, but maybe like not a full acceptance of this kind of thing.
Or there's some cognitive dissonance about this or something.
Like they still want it to be good, but they know it's not good. And so it's just interesting seeing these sort of like retraction watch websites come up with things, and you're like, well, this is what happens. And I imagine,
and I think like you shouldn't really need that many retractions if you just realize that there's nothing wrong with publishing errors as long as people then come in and show that those things were errors. In my opinion, retraction should be sort of restricted to like fraud or like just things that were like the data was just like not what it actually was. That the data that was reported was not the actual data. Those kinds of cases, you want to retract. But if it's just like, well, this first study seemed to show this, but later on we learned it was quite slightly different, that seems like the kind of thing that you don't need a retraction for.
Yep.
You just need that kind of awareness, as you're saying, that like, look, just because something's published doesn't mean it's perfect or even all that good. And I think sort of having this kind of post-publication peer review system would help with that, because if you publish everything, it'll be, I think, much easier for people to keep this awareness that, look, this has been published, but like anyone can publish anything. Like there's no reason to expect it's good just because it's published.
Exactly. Did you have any, not to get too off topic, but did you have any take on the whole publishing fiasco from last year? It was with the gender studies publishing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say anything that hasn't already been said by other people, but I think one problem with it was like, it was hardly like a randomized controlled trial. Like they only attacked the disciplines where they already thought was something wrong.
I know.
And it's also getting to a point with these hoax studies where like, yeah, we get it now. And at this point, you're just wasting reviewers' time by like not telling them that you're doing an experiment and just going in and flooding these journals with hoax papers.
I know. It was kind of it was an unfortunate attempt. I think that generally came to be the consensus, that it was almost in some ways, you're right, unethical in some ways or distracting at best to kind of take this on. It would have been interesting. I can't really think of another way with which some kind of a hoax-like process, I suppose, like a randomized kind of thing. But even so, like, if you're trying to show something new, I don't know what you would have done. But yeah, it definitely didn't have the same. I mean, it definitely wasn't well received in most circles. Yeah. And so, yeah. Okay, so there's some really great work. I'm very impressed, and it seems like a lot of your work has a lot of potential to be very impactful, both in the philosophy of science as well as the science itself. In terms of the future for your work and in the social dimension of science, how do you see yourself carrying forward?
Yeah, so I'm currently working, as I said, on peer review, and I have this research grant for the next few years to work on that. So I guess that's my agenda for the next few years, sort of set. I'm going to be thinking about peer review and biases in peer review and alternative ways of organizing peer review, and see what we can do there. But I mean, more generally, I think this is a field that's still quite understudied. We've only really started studying the social dimensions of science as philosophers relatively recently. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of room for people to come in and go beyond sort of scratching the surface, which I think is kind of all we've done so far.
Yeah.
There's a lot of modeling work on this topic, and there's a lot of open space there for people to go in and try to test, see if we can calibrate these models better, test them empirically in some ways, bring them more in conversation with some of the work that's being done by sociologists and economists working in these areas. There's plenty to do, I think.
Fantastic. Okay. And how are things? I guess so. We spoke at the very beginning of the interview. You're gearing up to do your work at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Western Australia in Perth.
Yes, that's right. So I accepted a position at UWA a while ago. At this point, I'm actually as of right now, I'm moving there in 3 days.
Wow.
And but then this grant came through as well, which I can which is sort of tied to the Netherlands. So I'm doing that at the University of Groningen. So for the next few years, I'll be splitting my time between UWA and Groningen, which is quite a luxury position to be in.
Yeah. So I guess, how do you see, I guess we won't know until you get there, but how do you see maybe your time in Western Australia being, something new or something, helpful in terms of your work and or your way of thinking about and doing philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, for me, so I've been a postdoc for the past 2.5 years. So moving to UWA is also a chance to do a bit more teaching
Uh-huh.
and develop myself in that area a bit more. So I'm quite excited about that. And of course, it's a great adventure to move to the other side of the world.
Yeah.
It's just a casual 17-hour flight away from here.
Oh, boy.
So it really is almost exactly the opposite end of the world. So I'm very excited. It's going to be late summer there when I arrive. And although that said, spring is starting here, so it's beautiful right here right now as well. But yeah, I'm sure it'll be very nice, climate-wise as well.
Fantastic. Well, okay. Well, let's. We're coming a little bit to the end of our time, so let me conclude with the final question of the interview, which is, what do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
Greatest challenge, yeah. So, I mean, one thing that I think is really great about philosophy of science where we stand today is that we've really sort of broadened the range of topics that we study. Mm-hmm. So as I was just saying, like social epistemology of science is kind of still a relatively new thing, but people are definitely doing that now and being taken seriously. There's things that I'm aware of. There's formal epistemology going on as well. And then there's people studying a lot of specific sciences, like yourself studying psychiatry, but in general, people expanding horizons beyond sort of traditional physics and maybe biology as it was being studied. You've got a lot of practice-oriented work going on. So there's people doing all these different things under the umbrella of philosophy of science, in addition to the sort of traditional questions on confirmation, theory of choice, realism, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really cool and something we should keep and should try to expand. So that's not really a challenge. That's just something I think we're doing really well right now.
Good to hear.
Yeah, I think in terms of the challenges for the field, I would say they're largely things that we share with a lot of the rest of academia. I think we could do a lot better at finding non-academic jobs for graduate students, given the shortage of academic jobs. I think we could do a lot more to fight casualization, people getting stuck in temporary teaching positions where it's not clear if they have long-term prospects.
Sure.
I think we can do more. This certainly goes for philosophy of science, but probably for a lot of scientific fields, to show our social relevance. Definitely mea culpa. It's not like I've done a lot on this, but I think, with these debates, like I was just talking about climate change or public health or whatever, there's, I think, definitely a lot that philosophers of science have to say that's relevant here about when and who to trust and on what basis, and just getting a better understanding of just explaining a bit more about what we understand how science works and how that's relevant in these controversial issues. There's a lot of things that philosophers of science could say, but they don't always take the time or the opportunity to bring that out there to the non-philosophers and the non-academics. So I guess, those challenges, I think, they're largely challenges that we all face as academics, but they are important things.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this, and thank you for taking the time to chat with us today and to share about your growing research and very pressing, important stuff that's going on in the social dimension of science, social epistemology of science, as well as these things that are going to be particularly relevant to not only philosophers of sciences but directly to scientists as well. Is there anything at the end here you'd like to mention we didn't quite get to in our chat? Anything you'd like to plug or leave us with?
Well, I guess I'll be at the University of Western Australia as of a few days from now. So any philosophers of science that are interested in coming out to Perth should definitely come visit, give a talk or something. Yeah, that'd be great. It's a little out of the way, but could be a fun trip. And other than that, I'm just very happy to to feature it on the show. It's been good fun.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Remco, for taking the time, and it was a real pleasure getting to meet and chat with you. And yeah, hopefully we'll be seeing you soon at a conference, or if Earth brings us this way.
Yeah, likewise.
Right. Well, good luck on the move and everything, and best of luck, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye bye.